We're going to go to bring the London perspective in i24 news correspondent there in the UK, Jonathan Sacerdoti. Jonathan, thank you for joining us this morning.
Good morning.
So here, of course, the ceasefire has been accepted, but if you do look at the players involved, it's mainly Western-backed players or Western-backed governments, such as the Sisi government themselves. And thus, the question is, of course, how long will this stick, and how much pressure has been put on by Western governments? We did hear, of course, of the Middle East envoy of the quartet, Tony Blair, being much more involved than other leaders in the world in pushing for a ceasefire.
Yes, and in a statement to the House of Commons yesterday, William Hague, the outgoing Foreign Secretary, called for the restoration of Palestinian Authority control in Gaza and a permanent end to the unacceptable threat of rocket attacks and other forms of violence. And he called again for a ceasefire, which he's been pushing for some days now, since really the beginning of the operation there.
Meaning there was a unanimous, would you say, consensus among Western governments that the ceasefire, even if Hamas is not being consulted, is the best way out?
I think the international community, and particularly speaking here from London, one can see there's a desire in Westminster. They particularly want there just to be a cessation of violence. They want to see a de-escalation, as they keep saying. I think Western leaders find it uncomfortable when Israel is engaged in military action. And while they do say that they stand behind the principle of self-defense, that Israel has that right to defend itself against this terrorist threat, the ongoing rockets being launched from the Gaza Strip into Israel, and now not just the south, but all over. While they do frequently reiterate their support of that principle, they also look at the figures coming out of Gaza of the deaths and the number of casualties, and then of course they feel that they need to express their dissatisfaction with that. And often there's a complete misunderstanding in the media, at least here, and that trickles down into political discourse of the idea of proportionality, that somehow proportionality, a term used in international law, can be measured by the number of deaths on either side, when of course proportionality refers to something quite different in terms of the amount of force needed to achieve the military goal of stopping the terrorist attacks. However, it is fair to say that the politicians realize that nobody wants to see the number of casualties coming out of Gaza that they're seeing now in the news, whether confirmed or unconfirmed, those numbers by Hamas. And they do want to see a de-escalation. Whether or not that means that in the future Israel will face such an attack again or ongoing rockets seems to be secondary to simply cooling down the situation right now.
But of course, the biggest criticism, by the way, both from the left and the right, is that this is only a short-term solution. The right-wingers will say this is, this does keep the situation under calm for maybe a quiet period of time, but the threat is still there. While on the left, we'll hear that this is not a long-standing solution for the long term, because this is not bringing us any closer to a two-state solution. Something that we did hear from the U.S. President Barack Obama yesterday.
That's right. It's a catch-22 in many ways, and I think Western governments recognize that, but have the luxury, certainly here in the UK, of not really needing to care too much without wanting to put too fine a point on it. Their aim, of course, as a relatively short-term thing, is to keep the approval of their electorate, working on roughly 4-year election cycles, and so as long as they can keep things as calm as possible with this government in the UK seems to want minimal actual involvement in the Middle East. It's very supportive of John Kerry's initiatives. It does occasionally make supportive sounds towards Israel, but on the whole, it would rather not get involved. There's less to get involved in if there isn't a military operation ongoing, and I think that's really the matrix that is involved in their decision-making there. Of course, Mr. Netanyahu has said that he didn't want a ceasefire that lasted only a couple of days or a few weeks so that Hamas could regroup and fire more rockets. And I'm sure in principle, William Hague, David Cameron and Philip Hammond, who's said to be replacing William Hague in the cabinet reshuffle due to take place today.
Right.
I'm sure none of these people want to see further attacks on Israel. But on the other hand, they don't tend to go into too much depth in discussing how they see this mapping out after any potential ceasefire taking place.
Right. Jonathan, stay with us. We're going to bring this question also into studio. Selena, the biggest question is, of course, is this all a matter of politics? As we heard, the politicians abroad do want to see an end to the firing because it serves their interests well, but no one really is pushing for a two-state solution, not from the outside, and definitely, one will say, not from the current Israeli government. Maybe we do hear voices from the opposition, but those are quieter voices.
I think the two-state solution is still the only game in town. There is no alternative.
But nobody wants to speak about it now.
Nobody wants to speak about it now because now we focus on restoring quiet in Gaza, and that should be the priority. But once we do that, we should look, as Colette rightly said so, to the condition to create for a more sustainable ceasefire in Gaza. And that includes reinforcing the Palestinian Authority stature and Mahmoud Abbas in Gaza, based on the arrangement between Hamas and Fatah, the Shati Reconciliation Agreement, the government of consensus that has been established on June 2nd. And I think this is the base to create, to reinforce the two-state solution. Under the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, and to enable him to generate positive incentive to the Gaza population. And I think this should be the base for a more moderate voice in Gaza that will support stability, and it will further diminish the legitimacy of players like Hamas to turn to violence.
But for that to happen, Colette, we do need a government that will include Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in the current situation. Right now, he has been excluded from the discourse.
Maybe by the Israelis, I'm sorry, but not by the Egyptians. They're part of the conversations now in Egypt, and I think if it were up to the Israeli government, if I was there, I would definitely want Abu Mazen to be the broker and to be the mediator in such a case, because that would be the only way to reinforce him, to give him again some prestige in Gaza, to be the man who can bring something to the Gazans, and to create this kind of synergy inside this new government that he has created.
Because we do hear the rhetoric coming from U.S. President Barack Obama calling for exactly that. But does it mean that the United States is maybe fatigued already from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is not putting the pressure on Netanyahu to do so? Or Netanyahu is simply not interested in bringing in Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas into the talks?
It seems to me that both are true. I think that probably after the mission of Kerry, which was probably relentless but not successful. I think the Americans probably are taking a step back. I don't see them wanting to be as active as they were before. And without them being very active, I don't see us moving ahead, because I don't think Europe is going to do it. And if there's no help from the outside, I doubt it very much that anyone in the Israeli government will have the incentive. It's true that the Prime Minister has been repeating the mantra of two states, but it is also true that this is not a government policy and that it has not been accepted as government policy. So I wouldn't count on this government to go further in order either to strengthen Abu Mazen or to, unless they're going to be very pragmatic about it. And I don't see them wanting to get back to the negotiating table to speak about the two-state solution. Unfortunately, I mean, that's how I see it.
But also Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas is himself in a tricky situation, because he does, of course, probably most likely hear U.S. President Barack Obama's words and agree with his maybe overall sentiment, but he has his own constituents as well to deal with, and he has to show a certain face, of course, in the face of Hamas, which is, as we said, gaining popularity now.
Yeah, which is the most thing that President Abbas doesn't like, the fact that he is now obliged to...
He's a middleman right now.
His representative in the UN obliged to defend the Gaza cause, while Abu Mazen thinks that the responsibility, there are two sides for this responsibility. Israel and Hamas share the same responsibility for this escalation. President Abbas defined Hamas and Israel as war dealers and blood dealers, and accusing Hamas at this period of being war dealers, while the traditional Palestinian rhetoric was accusing Israel and putting aside the Palestinian Palestinian responsibility, and Abbas is now obliged to play the game of Hamas. Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli policy pushed Abu Mazen towards Hamas, and he finds himself obliged to defend the Gaza cause, while he traditionally believed that rockets are against the Palestinian interests and have no impact, but military and politically damage to the Palestinian people and to the Palestinian cause. The Egyptians try, as Mr. Vidal said, to bring Abu Mazen in front of the scene. The Israelis, of course, want to focus over the military part of the Egyptian paper and not the political part of the Egyptian paper. And I'm afraid that if this will be the Israeli position, the Egyptians will find themselves at the end of the day obliged to talk politics with Hamas, the politics of the Gaza Strip with Hamas and not with the Palestinian Authority.
Jonathan, do you want to step in here?
Sure. I mean, it's not a particularly British perspective, but it is fair to say, I think, that when you have the Palestinians' own UN envoy saying that he acknowledges that every single rocket coming out of Gaza is a human rights crime and is against international law, Mahmoud Abbas is indeed in a very difficult position to be able to mediate. But this is what happens when you take a leadership role and your job is to be the leader of a unity government, which involves essentially a terrorist organization that launches those sorts of rockets. And I think that is the very difficult position he's put in. And when we then bring Egypt into the equation with this ceasefire proposal, it's also fair to say that Egypt has no particular interest in strengthening Hamas right now.
Yeah, indeed. And we have been speaking about Egypt's role quite extensively. Jonathan, thank you for joining us. I want to thank all my guests for this lovely discussion. We're going to be back after this very short break with more i24 News special broadcast, Operation Protective Edge.
Thank you.